Hi, I wanted to create a video showing my process for 3D modeling. This will be a short series showing high poly modeling, ray topology, map baking, texture painting, and import into Unreal Engine. This particular video will focus on the high poly modeling part. This took me around 11 hours to complete this asset using Maya and ZBrush. I wanted to share my process for using these two programs to create an original concept based on a rough sketch and some reference images. I think that anybody can do this, and I think there are a lot of videos out there that focus too much on step-by-step formulaic education and don't focus enough on how to create something different and unique. So this will be, most of it will be time-lapsed because there's no point in anybody watching 11 hours of real-time modeling, but it's impossible to create something like this in really less than 11 hours. So it'll be time-lapsed. I'll slow it down at some parts where I deem it necessary. Diving right in, I always start by gathering my reference, which you just saw, and then, putting it up on one monitor and jumping into Maya in my other monitor. Most important thing right off the bat is to establish scale. You may have seen earlier I have the Unreal mannequin. I always import him into a fresh scene to make sure I'm working at roughly the right scale. A lot of beginners make the mistake of assuming that when they create a primitive like a cube in Maya, it's roughly large, like human size. What they don't realize is it's exactly 1 centimeter cubed. So 1 Maya unit is 1 centimeter. That means every cube you create to make it a meter, you scale it up to 100. So working at scale is important because all of the tools in Maya assume real-world scale. So you'll find things like bevels and multi-cuts just behave very strangely if you don't work in real-world scale. I try to work fast in Maya. I have a lot of things set on hotkeys, and I don't use that many menus when I can help it. I'll do my best to kind of explain the tools that I'm using, but for the most part, I really only use a handful of tools, those being the basic selection and transformation tools, move, scale, and rotate, as well as a handful of things like inset, extrude, bevel, multi-cut, weld, target weld, and quad draw. Really, aside from the basic just movement and selection tools in Maya, if you can, master quad draw and multi-cut, you can make, most shapes. And that's what it's really all about, is, being able to create shapes that are solid rather quickly. Of course, here I'm using some subdivision modeling. Subdivision modeling is, of course, an important technique. This video is going to be aimed largely towards beginners, so I'll try to explain some things that if you're a seasoned modeler, you've probably already known, but there's probably a few tricks in here I use that might be valuable to even seasoned modelers. Especially, I think, the custom script that I use for passing models back and forth between Maya and ZBrush, which you'll see in action here quite a lot. I will make that script available, and I'll link it in the description or somewhere. You'll be able to find that. It's a simple script. All it does is it just saves your current selection to an OBJ file, and then you can use another script in ZBrush to import it. But despite it being that simple, the amount of time you save without having to browse to file dialogues is extreme, to say the least. One thing I'm doing here that I think that I also see a lot of beginners kind of fail to understand is I'm trying to make a compound surface, but it's really not important for me to model it as one object. There's really nothing wrong with having lots of objects. And so I'm taking advantage of that using 2 separate surfaces and just placing them together. You can really get away with a lot with that, especially considering later on we will be retopologizing this anyway. and the ambient occlusion you'll bake will kind of blend all these surfaces together anyway, so to certainly utilize multiple sub-objects as much as you can. You may notice here that I'm creating a sphere, but rather than starting with a sphere primitive, I'm starting with a cube and then applying subdivision to it. This is almost always what you want from a sphere because it gives you much better topology. I'll probably talk a little bit about topology throughout this video, but really it's the goal with topology is just to have your edges flowing around the model in such a way that makes the shape look as good as possible, and of course having your faces be roughly the same size and evenly spaced. Now, another thing about that I see a lot of beginners struggle with is either over or under emphasizing the importance of topology in their models. Don't get me wrong, topology is always important, but it's less important in a high poly model, right? Because the high poly model is never actually going to make contact with the game engine. As long as it looks good, and as long as you can bake all the information from your high poly model down onto your low poly model, it's the topology of the low poly model that matters. Now, of course, that said, you can set yourself up for failure if you ignore topology altogether during your high poly. But I think it's a skill you learn over time, basically how much effort you need to put into your topology of your high poly model. Here's an example of the value of keeping everything separate and as their own sub-objects. You can make these big form changes without having to worry about reworking your topology everywhere. Here's one of those rare examples where a primitive sphere is better, or at least it's adequate. Could have probably done this with a subdivided cube as well. This here is going to end up being a computer screen. The idea is this is a kind of retro sci-fi, fantastical computer backpack that can be, left places and used to call in supply drops and things like that. And so this will have some special effects later on in the material in Unreal where we'll have some animated screens and we'll play those as video files and have a glass shader and probably a little CRT flickering material as well. Something that I've noticed while recording and editing this video is a great deal of time is spent not exactly modeling, but just kind of, panning around the model and thinking about what to do next. I think that's probably unavoidable. Still just kind of focusing on trying to get the right proportions on this and just lay a solid foundation. You'll see me do this a lot, use a selection and extract it to create like a frame or a little sub-object. This is, I've not actually found a way to do this with the default Maya tools, at least not easily. I use a plugin called DP Smart Combine or Smart Mesh Tools, which I'll link, and it's invaluable in my opinion. The default Maya system for joining and separating meshes leaves lots of empty groups behind and is just kind of generally sort of messy, and this plugin handles it a lot better. Here I'm using multi-cut to just trim off this excess. This is one of those cases where, you know, were this the low poly mesh, you wouldn't really be able to do this, but it's the high poly mesh, so if it creates a lot of weirdly shaped triangles on the sides, you know, I don't really care because they won't be visible. I use a polydraw quite a bit to create little, you know, one-dimensional primitive shapes. When making complicated shapes, I like to start one-dimensional and then kind of gradually refine it into 3 dimensions as needed. Here I'm utilizing a subdivision surface to create some nice rounded corners. What I'm modeling here, as you'll see, is it's actually going to be a cutter piece. And so yeah, so I just inset and flattened that to create that edge. And what I'm trying to do is create something that I can use to cut into the back to create sort of a little what would you describe it as? Well, you'll see, just a little detail piece. This could, of course, be used as a floater and just simply bake floating normal map details, but I find it's usually worth the effort to just go ahead and model it in. Right now I'm trying to find the right placement for these details. Using mirror. This is another technique I use often, is when I'm trying something out that I'm not sure of, I'll duplicate a piece and just move it off to the side so that if I end up making a mistake, I can just delete the ruined geometry and bring the old copy back. That's faster than saving a version of the file, although I do that too. I'm utilizing the fact that these are all moving relative to their own relative transforms to do these kinds of kind of move them all at once. A little bit of rigging knowledge can come in handy with 3D modeling sometimes for things like this. So at this point I'm pretty happy with the layout of these little details, and I think I come back later to actually unify them into one solid mesh. But for now, I'm happy with just knowing that they'll make sense being there. You know, it's a lot like when you are sketching on paper, you know, you don't want to over detail. You want to kind of work evenly across your composition, being careful to work out everything roughly before diving into too much detail. So now I start moving into creating some other features, like these are the buckles, I believe. I just use the poly draw tool to create a flat shape, and here I'm utilizing subdivision smoothing to create the actual like curves of the surface. So you see how it goes from being a a very angular low poly shape to when you apply smoothing, those things that are sharp edges start to become round, and then you can sharpen the parts that you want to be sharp by inserting edge loops. Inserting edge loops is easy with the multi-cut tool or the quad draw tool. In a lot of my old meshes, I would spend a pretty good bit of time detailing things like bolts and screws. I'd copy real world screws and bolts, and work really hard on making them detailed and realistic. But what I've found is, at least in the context of game meshes, oftentimes that detail doesn't end up being visible. So this game has more of a stylized look anyway. For an ultra realistic game, I would model a library of screws and bolts, and I would utilize those. But really, it's oftentimes, I think it can look better to just use a sphere, because it's going to be so small in the final mesh, the final composition. When you look at it from the perspective of the game, you'll be lucky to see those little bolts at all. So there's really no point in over detailing them. You see, I started this little clamp piece as two separate parts, using a cylinder and poly draw, and then I just kind of, union them together and give them volume. I like adding these little creases too inside edges. It often gives it a little more detail, a little more realism. It's these subtle little things that really end up selling a piece and making it look just a little bit better. Now that I'm happy with this buckle, you see I just duplicated it and put it on a hidden layer. Now I can freely transform and scale and play with this and get it situated in space without having to worry about losing any work. If I decide I want to try a different one, I can always just unhide that layer and duplicate it again. Here you see I just split this back part of the mesh, duplicated it, and moved a copy off to the side. That's because I'm preparing to cut into it and make it one piece with these insets. And since it's going to be a destructive process, I wanted to have a backup. So as you can see, I just deleted the main face, and now it's just a somewhat tedious process of just going through and just bridging the geometry between all these floating pieces and the frame around it. Like I said before, I could have probably gotten away with leaving those details as floating pieces and just baking them in. But, you know, sometimes it's just worth kind of going the extra mile and connecting everything, making everything one piece. I find it helps as well to kind of try to isolate the different parts of the model from each other. So that's why I split this from the front. That way I can focus just on this one piece, and when I'm done, then I can just rejoin it. Here I'm utilizing symmetry, splitting this so that I only have to work on 1/2 or 1/4 even. Yeah, I just deleted half, mirrored it. Now with half complete, I can just duplicate it, scale it negative, flip the normals, and then I'll recombine these and run. I just ran merge vertices with a small tolerance, so that there aren't any doubled up vertices. And now, since I didn't even really modify any of the edge topology, I can just merge it back with the main piece. And it looks like maybe I did add one edge, and that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just kind of reconnecting them, making sure there aren't any disconnected edges. Yep, just checking points, making sure there aren't any doubled up ones. And then bridging the loops. Checking smoothing, and it smooths pretty well. Adding a few edge loops there to sharpen the smoothed result. And now I can delete that backup piece because my operation worked out. Testing my pivots, testing if this door closes and hinges quite properly. Here I'm starting to make a little detail. This is the idea here is it's a little hatch that opens up that a antenna or something can be unwound from. I never ended up doing all the modeling on the inside, which I was planning to do, but so this is just a little detail. Still, it adds a little visual variety to the shape. It makes it a little bit more interesting. You'll see that most of the process here, so this is another usage of using the smart mesh tools to use an extraction. On that extraction, simply using extrude and bevel to create more details, multi-cut to clean up topology where needed. Here, deleting half, using mirror to save myself a little time. Inserting edges, adding a little detail there. And just playing with the thickness. Just trying to keep the simple things simple. It's at this point that I edited out some of the process. You see I've got some straps and some basic cloth pieces. I really ended up not liking those though, and I ended up deleting them. So I edited out the process of making them don't worry, I used the same process to make the part later on that I did end up using. But now what I'm doing is I'm just blocking out the straps. And I did include this part because it's a good example of kind of sketching in 3D. You see, I started with a flat shape, approximating the contour of the piece that I wanted, and then just kind of bending it into position. I didn't even back it up. I didn't even worry about, the fact that bending this would lose the original topology, because, I was able to make that topology in just a few seconds, maybe a minute. So, it's not even worth preserving because I can remake it so easily. And in fact, this particular iteration of the strap gets totally not even used, but I did want to show this process of blocking it out because I think it's important. Here, what I'm doing is I'm duplicating the entire backpack, and there I delete my the cube that started it all. And I've got the Unreal Mannequin in this file. He's been here the whole time on a hidden layer. And so what I'm doing now is I'm positioning this copy of the backpack into position with him to test if everything is roughly the right size. Because I want the straps to be, possible to actually, reach around a human's shoulders. Even if this thing is never actually worn by a character, it'll be, it'll just be kind of weird if it's not the right proportions. So it's always important to utilize that scale reference. At this point, I'm satisfied that this is roughly the right size. So I start blocking in the rest of the straps. And trying to think a little bit about the, how this would physically connect. This is all based off of the sketches that I showed at the beginning as well. And remember, those sketches, I didn't spend all that much time on, but the time that I did spend, I was thinking about the construction of this thing. And so the idea being that there's this cloth piece that's held on, and then the straps sew maybe to the back of that cloth piece. But again, all of this I end up deleting and not even using, and the end result ends up not looking very much like my concept art. And sometimes that happens. It's an indication probably that I rushed through the concept phase and should have given it more thought. But sometimes that's just how it goes. The important thing is to get it done somehow, adapt. Just here, I used to say I brought in a buckle. The buckle is a simple shape I modeled. I keep a copy of it on a hidden layer so I can bring them in whenever I need them. And I'm just keeping the straps to be one-sided. They're just flat poly strips. And the important thing at this point is to get them just in place, right? Here you see I'm rethinking the construction, attaching it behind this other strap rather than behind the whole cloth panel. Again, this whole construction gets reworked in the end, but these straps probably did survive in some form into the final build. As you can see, I'm also modeling both sides, whereas in the final high poly mesh, I ended up going with them being symmetrical, just mirroring one over. My plan, though, is because eventually this thing will probably be rigged, at least in some form, and so I can always deform the low poly mesh using the rig to introduce asymmetry to the shape. So even though the texture will be symmetrical, adding that asymmetry, at the later phase will still make it look natural, and that way we'll save texture resolution. Often when I mirror elements, it's partially to save time, but more importantly, it's to save texture resolution. Doing a quick material ID blocking pass, trying to get an idea of what's going to be its own, kind of piece in the final texture. And here I'm adding this plane because I'm picturing this backpack being often an environmental piece that just sits in the environment somewhere. The idea being like some scouting team leaves these behind, and that they're a communications device to get to talk back to the ship. So they leave them at campsites and things like that, and you'll find them scattered throughout the open world. But so because of that, I want it to look natural sitting on the ground. So hence why I bring in a flat plane, and now I'm reworking the straps to try to make them look like they, make them look natural in a sitting position. Again, this work ends up being ultimately, perhaps a little bit of a waste of time, because the final high poly I modeled in just a neutral pose, with the intention being down the line rigging the straps. With the straps rigged, I can then create multiple poses to use this on the ground, or tipped on its side, or on a character's back, and I can use the same mesh in all those situations. But at this point, I hadn't quite decided on that yet. I was still figuring things out, and this is, in a sense, this is 3D concept art. Here I'm doing another pass on trying to figure out how the straps might conform to being worn on a character's back. Rather than duplicating the backpack this time, I just duplicate my character mesh and put him in position. And at this point in time, what I was going for was to find a resting pose for the straps that would work in both situations, both on the ground and on a character's back. There I just used quad draw with live surface turned on to create a poly strip conforming to the character's torso. It's a very, very quick way to create geometry that is relative to another model. It looks like this may be where I decided to mirror it. With the straps blocked in, I next start to turn my attention back to the hard surface components, specifically to address this big empty space on this shape. This is going to end up being like a kind of radio sort of control panel, tuner sort of thing. So I'm making a backup, and now I'm starting out by prepping the topology to kind of be to kind of lay out the topology in a way that's going to make it easy for me to cut into it with the details that I want. So you see I used polydraw, extrude, created a shape, used bevel to give it a round edge. Now I'm starting to cut in more details. Now I have the frame for my radio dial. I'm playing around with the profile and the contours here. You'll notice I always try to avoid any kind of 90-degree surface change, especially on a flat surface. The reason for this is when we go to bake our texture maps, a 90-degree surface change will be invisible on a normal map. So we always want to keep our changes gradual so that we get the best detail out of our normal map. Here I'm prepping this surface to cut into it. You could do this with a boolean, but it's often just kind of better to, you're going to have to clean the boolean up so much, it's often better to just do it by hand. And then I can just merge these together and target weld the points. After you do this a few times, you get to be pretty fast at it. Connecting up the n-gons, try to create, so that Maya knows, so that Maya can create decent geometry for us, and that when and if we have to triangulate this, we'll get decent, predictable results. Playing around with the display, cutting it in further, and now rejoining it with my original mesh. Instantly, this is starting to look more interesting. I'm trying to give this a little more room because since this dial is such a prominent feature, I want it to take up as much room as possible. So kind of pushing it to try to give it a little more space so that the details I end up putting in here won't go to waste. I'm grabbing some cylinders just to represent the knobs. The idea with this is it's a computer that connects to a computer network, but the theme of this is it's an atom punk game, right? So what would a 50s computer mobile terminal look like? Well, it would probably look a lot like a radio, right? And that's just that's just the creative direction I wanted for this. So I'm taking inspiration from 50s radios, even though this is a computer. Spending a little more time on the straps, trying to make them look natural. And now I'm back to figuring out these dials. So you see I just took one of my dials and copied it and moved it to the origin so I can work on its details with symmetry. Creating detail by duplicating, resizing things. You may notice I often work with the viewport AO or ambient occlusion turned on in Maya. I think this helps a lot because you see how we've got all of these separate surfaces, but the ambient occlusion kind of blends them together for us, right? And we can utilize that because we're going to bake an ambient occlusion map for our final asset. So it's a good idea to kind of see what the ambient occlusion is going to look like, at least roughly. And that helps inform my decisions on whether I'm going to leave something as two separate meshes or if I'm going to try to join them and model a union between them. Here I'm trying to figure out the ridges in this dial. You see I copied my cylinder off to the side so that I can restart. I tried using the existing topology of the dial, but it didn't quite work, so it looks like I decided to just model a ridge myself. Keeping it 2D, just utilizing subdivision. And now just placing it through the other mesh, just to see if this will give me what I want, so I can decide how many instances of this I need. Using duplicate special with a rotation offset. I'm utilizing the snap settings on the rotation tool here to make sure they're evenly spaced. Maya crash happens to everyone. That's why you should save your progress all the time. Jumping back in, I didn't really lose much. I've edited out a few of these crashes, by the way. There's always some. Here I'm just trying to construct this base profile for this knob. Utilizing symmetry again. And then I can just bridge this and start working out the topology as much as it needs to be. It's important to work on the edges because that's where the smoothing will be most apparent. Topology in large flat surfaces of subdivision surfaces is often less important. I might even be able to leave this as an n-gon, but I didn't. Might have been able to, but it doesn't hurt to at least, give it a quick, create a quick cut through it to help it out. But you see what I care about the most here is the edges. And this created a pretty nice little shape, a nice little, looks like something you could grip. That's something that you want in your model. You want it to have like a kind of tactile feel. You want someone to look at it and kind of picture what it feels like. Part of this will be accomplished through texturing, obviously. I mean, of course, texturing is of paramount importance for that, but don't discount your ability to create texture in your model itself. In the end, your texture will only be as good as your model. This is another good example of using multiple submeshes intersected together to create what in reality would be a single cast piece. I could have taken the time to actually union and model the transitions between each of these pieces, but I believe that just the AO on its own does enough of the work to ground all these parts together that it's not necessary. And think about it, how big is this thing, right? It's, it's like an inch in diameter, so like if I'd put that work into that, it would have just been wasted. Adding some quick material block-ins. And now I'm getting ready to duplicate this and put it back into position in context of the mesh, the full model, I mean. You can see too, as I'm thinking about material definitions, I try to keep my materials to a minimum, or my large contrasting materials to a minimum, Usually about 3. So I usually have 2 kinds of metal, which I'll use throughout like the main body, and then I'll have one bright colored accent. So you see I'm using the same material for the red knob on the button and the red dial on the radio. If you use too many accents or too many different materials, it just becomes difficult to read and just makes the composition muddy. And you see I'm kind of getting a little bit of mileage out of my out of this knob by using only 1/2 of it for a whole nother knob. I can kind of was able to create a little bit of variation in here, made it look a little more detailed than it was. And the idea with this is it's like a headphone jack or something like that. So just a very simple cylinder with some bevels. Sometimes that's all it takes. But this makes it look a lot more interesting than if this was just 4 of the same knob repeated over and over. There I'm kind of breaking my rule of materials, but thinking about, if it is a headphone jack, then it would probably be gold plated because they are gold plated for audio quality reasons. Now I'm getting ready to detail the inside panel of this door, this cover. Again, utilizing splitting a polygon from the base mesh to create a detail. Even just that makes it look more interesting, right? And using a bevel so that there's no 90-degree contours. It's smooth, gradual contours. And it creates a breakup that makes it more interesting. Now these are, I'm modeling some Boolean cutters. So I'm modeling the negative space that I'm about to cut out of this base mesh. See there, I ran the Boolean. It had some issues, or I'm making sure that these cut all the way through. And I'm trying to clean up the topology on this mesh that I'm about to cut because the Booleans in Maya are, they don't handle n-gons very well, so you gotta try to prep your geometry a little bit before cutting. There, we're running the Boolean, and it worked pretty well. Now, of course, we've got all these n-gons that we need to clean up. So, deleting half. So I only have to clean up 1/2 of the mesh, and then I'll mirror it later. And here I'm adding an edge loop around the edges because this is going to make it smooth out much more nicely. Again, this kind of thing is a little tedious, but there's not really any other way to do it, at least not reliably, and it doesn't really take that long when you get used to it. I'm going through and creating as many cuts through this n-gon as I can so that it'll smooth predictably. And there you see I tested it, and that n-gon on the back created a lot of problems, so I just deleted it. Sometimes you can do that. And then here, because these surfaces are all hidden through their overlap with the other, I didn't actually have to really model proper edge flow there. I could just delete those faces. Now I'm just extending the cuts through there so that they smooth along the way along the way that they should. And that looks so much cooler just with just that little bit of work. And then with all that edge flow established, it's easy to fill those gaps and create another little layer that just adds a little more depth and variety. Now you see I'm playing with the just set back the core piece there, and now I'm playing with kind of overlaying them to create a more kind of compound surface. Here I've parented this little detail piece to the other piece so that I can test the opening and closing the door while still maintaining these two meshes as separate objects. Here I'm getting started on another panel. The idea with design sometimes, I think, is to start with a simple shape. Like in our case, this whole door is just it's just an oval, and then just cutting it up. So just cutting it up and dividing it into other simple shapes, and that starts to create complex shapes. Add a few details, like these very simple bolts. If you're designing something more realistic, grab some bolts from your library. And instantly this is starting to look pretty good. And of course, remember, we're making this for a game. This thing is never going to be taking up probably more than, like how big is this thing ever going to be on screen, right? Even if you walk right up to it and you're interacting with it, it's probably only going to be taking up a quarter of your screen at most. So, that's only 1,000 pixels, right? It's pretty small. You don't need that much detail. You won't be able to see it. Now that I've got all of these big things taken care of, I'm going in and creating the final surface for this main piece. Again, I'm keeping it separate because that is the simplest way to do it. I can work on just half, making a mirrored instance. Just trying to create interesting surface changes, focusing on my topology. Keeping my topology as loose as I can, and I'm going to rely on smoothing to add the details. Extruding individual edges and using target weld to reconnect them gives you a lot of control when surfacing something like this. And it's just a matter of making the room that you need to connect all your polygons. Test smooth and it looks pretty good. Applying the actual mirror now that my topology is done. And just a few more tweaks to major contours. Testing smoothing, adding hard edges. Here I'm using the shift option with the quad draw tool, which is a kind of a smooth operation. Can be very helpful. It's very good for making sure your topology is roughly evenly spaced. Just going through and just tweaking and making sure everything is roughly in place the way I want. Can be tedious. You see me often utilize the scale tool as an alignment tool. Select an edge and scale it to 0 on the world axis to ensure that everything is in line and straight. Now my base radio is done, and now I'm getting ready to send this to ZBrush to update. There you go, I'm loading my existing tool, selecting the old parts of the mesh and deleting them. And now I'm exporting my selections that I want to be subtools one at a time. What I'm doing here is I'm going to try to add some details to this in ZBrush. So you see I brought in a smoothed version of that surface, and now I'm using the Damien standard brush to just cut some details in. I can reform it with the move brush and the smooth brush. And I'm just freehand trying to cut some interesting kind of panel lines in here. I believe I ended up using this as the final high poly, whereas at the time I was intending it just as a sketch. I was intending I'd go through and remesh it later, but you know, look, it's just kind of fine, so I just kind of left it that way. This is one of my favorite parts of the process. So I had here a very rough ZBrush sculpt of a shoulder strap that I did not like at all, but what I'm doing here is I'm using it as reference just to get the proportion the same, and I'm creating in 2D the profile of a new shoulder strap. Here I'm creating an instance for mirroring. I find often using an instance duplicated and scaled on -1 works much better than using the built-in symmetry tools on Maya, which tend to be a little buggy. So I'm using just simple transformation tools along with multicut, and here I'm creating another instance so that I can only have to work on 1/4 of the mesh. use duplicate special, and you can set the transformation to negative, and then you can have one mesh that you can simply focus on and have it be updated in real time to the other copies. This works. This will keep working as long as you don't delete your history. So delete your history before you start, because as you probably know, the longer you let your history go, the weirder things get. So here I'm trying to just kind of establish some forms, some surface changes for this. I'm going to probably utilize subdivision smoothing to help me out a little bit. Here we go, creating more instances for the underside. Same process. And what I'm thinking about here is the kinds of fabric that this uses. How many different pieces it is, where the seams are. And I'm establishing the seams in Maya, and then later on I'll split it up and add details to these seams in ZBrush. There are certainly ways to do all of this in ZBrush, but for me, I just find creating a block out in Maya works much better. Maya just gives you so many opportunities to have tight edge control. Creating that little crease there with the multi-cut was just simple and easy. And you can just kind of quickly end up with a base that looks, you know, somewhat passable for a start. Here I'm just adding a little bit of volume to it, so it's kind of this same process of starting 2D and just gradually adding volume. I try not to use extrude any more than I have to, because I always want to have my topology be gradual changes. If you look closely here, you know, you'll see there are it's all curves, right? Like every surface change is gradual. There's no abrupt like 90-degree surface changes. And that's what we want for an organic shape. Here I'm using the shortcut to grow selection. It's shift and the period key, the greater than sign, and the less than sign will contract your selection. It's a good way you can select a loop and then grow it. Looks like I wasn't quite happy with that fold, so I just deleted it and recreated it. Just trying to get this ready to take into ZBrush. There we go, I'm separating it out into multiple pieces so that I can sculpt on them individually. Checking smoothing. And here's my plugin. So as you can see, I just created a cylinder, and I can just with one click import my mesh from Maya. It comes in with groups, and then you can just run groups split. You'll see I've got a little custom pop-up menu that I use for a lot of common operations in ZBrush. This helps me stay fast in ZBrush. I don't very often have to go into the right-hand menu digging for things, because almost everything is ready to hand. And this is where stuff starts to get fun, at least to me, is because when I've got these separated pieces ready, then I can come in and just start adding details, and I don't really have to worry about topology or anything. You know, I can just focus on just kind of making things look a little more natural. And you'll see as you watch, I really, there's only a handful of brushes I use in ZBrush. Those are pretty much the Damien standard or Dam standard brush, which I use to create these like sharp creases, clay tubes, which I use to add just a little bit of buildup and texture. You can see clay tubes right here. And other than that, H polish, smooth, and smooth stronger. Smooth and smooth stronger are just, you know, great for basically when you decide you don't like something. It's, you know, you can basically just erase it and then try again. But yeah, as you can see here, you can use clay tubes and Dam standard to just kind of sharpen edges, add a little bit more organicness. Here I'm using masking, and the transformation tools in ZBrush are also extremely powerful. Here I'm using H polish to take out some of that texture from the clay tubes brush. And now I'm using Dam standard to start blocking in some folds. You can have multiple subtools in ZBrush. That's what ZBrush calls objects, basically. And you can switch which one is active by Alt and left clicking on it. And so that's what I'm doing here. I just create a little crease. Here I'm loading up my smooth stronger. So I wasn't happy with that. And regular smooth wasn't cutting it, so smooth stronger to the rescue. This part is always the most fun to me, because it's just, I don't know, you just don't really have to think about it. Here I'm going back into Maya and I'm getting an extraction, and I'm going to use this to create like a little seam piece. So just bridged that, pushing the edge out along the normals using Control middle mouse, and then just append a new subtool and run my script to import that new little piece, and then using inflate. And instantly we have, this looks so much more real already because we've got these three surfaces all kind of working in tandem, and it was just, you know, it was trivial to create. And now I can just go through with the move brush and just shape it so that it all kind of fits together. Something I see beginners in ZBrush, they tend to be afraid of the move brush, or they tend to, you know, maybe underestimate its usefulness, but it's really a great brush and you shouldn't be afraid of it. It's certainly a workhorse. My personal hotkeys, I have move on 1, clay tubes on 2, Dam standard on 3, H polish on 4, and then of course shift is smooth. And really that's you'll see I might not even open the brush palette at all, because I really don't use any other brushes, which is, I think, kind of a theme in 3D. Any kind of 3D software is, you know, it's overwhelming when you look at it. You know, there's all this text, all this information, all these options, but what's really important is just kind of nailing, you know, that handful of tools that'll get you, you know, 80 to 90% of what you need, and then just map them to hotkeys, find some way to access them quickly and fluidly, and, you know, just speed yourself up. Because the faster you can access the tools, the faster you can, you know, get what's in your head down on the model. You know, as we've seen, like, so much of this, you know, time is spent thinking about what to do, the faster we can make our execution, the better. You know, the more models we can make, right? You know, this one took 11 hours. I shudder to think how much time I've spent on every model. As you can see, there's not a whole lot going on here. It's just repeating the same process of dam standard, clay tubes, H-polish, smooth, move, sometimes maybe using a mask. But yeah, ZBrush, at least for me, my ZBrush process is not that complicated, right? There's a lot that you can do in ZBrush. I mean, there's so many people that work entirely in ZBrush that create, amazing things. I don't know how to do that though, and I don't really see the benefit, right? Because I can use Maya to create a base mesh and then use ZBrush to just kind of apply this detail pass. One kind of rule of thumb for sculpting cloth is to try to create large triangular surface changes and don't just draw lines. I think here I'm about to use some masking techniques, starting with the dam standard and clay tubes to kind of establish that wedge shape that I was just talking about. Come to think of it, I don't know why I even really sculpted the back of the straps. They might not, well, I guess they'll be visible. When the thing's like lying on the ground, you might be able to see back into the back of the straps, but certainly the front is more important. If I had to pick one, could have just modeled the front and mirrored it to the back, right? Just map the same UV space on the texture. But I do like the way this ended up looking. Here's an example of using the masking in conjunction with simple move brush. Can create a cool little fold. And when you've got the surfaces working together the way we have here with the multiple subtools, it's just a pretty easy way to get some cool looking detail. Here I'm using dam standard to kind of accent the peak of the fold, and then kind of using clay tubes on the side to sort of blend it. Dam standard, clay tubes, smooth. And that starts to look pretty interesting, pretty organic. I by no means consider myself to be a master cloth sculptor. There are many out there that that do a much better job. That create stuff that's just mind blowing and amazing. But as a generalist, I think it's important to just kind of have a technique that's reliable, that kind of gets the job done, that'll look good enough when it's baked down into a normal and AO map. And that's what this is. I think that, especially when you're a beginner, if you can kind of, just learn some of these fundamentals to just kind of get your stuff just good enough, good enough to kind of pass muster, then, that's what's really important. My goal for this series is not necessarily to make you an expert ZBrush user, or the very best modeler in the world, but just show you kind of what's taken me a long time to learn, which is a game development pipeline from start to finish. High poly modeling, retopology, UV, baking, texturing, engine import, and after that, maybe rigging, some basic animation, and blueprint scripting to tie it all together. When you look at it from a macro perspective like that, you've got to kind of just, do your best on everything, because there's just so much to cover. If you go into the industry, you'll specialize, but my goal is to just kind of show a bird's eye view of the whole process of creating a game. Okay, so our sculpt is done, and now we're getting ready to bring it into Maya. My process is I use merge visible and then decimation master. I've got them both on my custom menu so I can access them very quickly. Decimation master will I usually hit it at about, 20K, something like that. Just enough to maintain the details, but keep it light. And then check it, make sure our topology looks good, or, right density. And then I just exported it. Now I'm using my script to import it into Maya. Now, here we have our decimated mesh in Maya. This is something that you probably won't see a lot of people do. It's certainly a destructive way to model, but it's fast. I'm just lining up the decimated mesh to get it roughly where it needs to be, and now I'm going to use a lattice to warp it into position. Now remember, we decimated this, and if you look closely, you'll see that there's a whole lot of stretching and, kind of ugly artifacts that end up happening because of that horrible decimated topology. But remember what I said about topology at the beginning, right? This is our high poly model. If it looks okay, it's okay. And when this is done, when we're done with our lattice, you know what we can always do? We can always go back to ZBrush, Dynamesh this, give it the once over with smooth, clay polish, etc. Dynamesh it and decimate it again. Bring it back here. And what are we going to have to do after that anyway? Retopologize for the game res model. So, yes, we're going to lose all of our nice original topology that we modeled. We're going to lose all of our subdivision surface, subdivision levels in ZBrush. At the end of the day, I don't think that matters. There's a lot of people that would disagree, but that's kind of my 2 cents on it. And you'll see this in a minute. We'll go back to ZBrush and kind of clean it all up, and then we'll Dynamesh it again. And there's nothing stopping you from just Dynameshing over and over on your high poly, right? And then using Decimation Master and then Dynameshing it again. Like on our high poly, topology is just so incidental. As long as we can kind of get the job done, we're going to spend time retopologizing it for the game model anyway. So why knock ourselves out with the topology for the high poly? See here, I'm just doing the same thing. In the end, I ended up just mirroring the straps anyway, so this turned out to be kind of a waste of time, but it's not, at least it's fast, right? You end up wasting time, so use the fastest techniques available to you, and you can get done in 11 hours as opposed to 22, right? Okay, so with our rough high poly shoulder straps put into place, the next part is, I think, one of the more interesting and important parts. So basically, we created some, very rough topology. We ruined it in a lot of ways, right? But, it's better than what we had, and it's easy for us to always go back in and make it better. So this is a technique that I use all the time. This is the quad draw tool in Maya, and you can use it in conjunction with live surface to create new geometry over existing geometry. I really like this technique a lot, this technique of creating rough geometry that is, not exactly good enough to actually use, but it's in the right place and it gets the idea across. And then using quad draw with live surface to use it as something I can build on top of and further refine. So what I'm doing now is I'm building some new straps, and you see how, I'm kind of paying attention to the construction of the material. These loops, they fit in between the seams of the existing piece, and that makes it look a little more real. It also helps us in our modeling, makes it easier to make things look more detailed without putting in a whole lot of extra work. There, I'm just using the extrude tool to give it some thickness. I'm going to be taking this into ZBrush probably fairly soon to add more details to it, but this is the block in. Now you see I have my multi-cut tool, and I'm just establishing edge loops to make this thing smooth out a little better. Subdivision modeling is useful not just for, hard surface mechanical things, but for organic things that you want to smooth in a particular way. Creating these inside loops is going to allow me to kind of give this some interesting shape before we even go to ZBrush. There I'm using push along the normals. It's control and middle mouse with the move tool active, and it'll push your polygons along their normals, which is different from scaling them. But yeah, see how I was able to build up that ridge, and now this looks like a much more interesting shape than if it was just simply, one straight loop. Now that I have it, it's easy to duplicate it. It's got clean topology. I don't have to make it twice. I can use the same one. And I'm just going to use move with proportional fall off to just kind of put it into place. This is how I like to approach topology when I'm in my high poly. Is I like to focus on putting it where it's going to help the most, and breaking things up into unique, or breaking things up into reusable parts. See, I'm just going through the same process. I'm just duplicating the same thing and just moving it into place. Proponents of procedural modeling will say, oh, but what are you going to do if you want to change the topology later, right? These are just copies. They're not instances. It's destructive. You can't go back. To which I answer, well, I don't need to go back. We did it right the first time, and it's good enough. Besides, this whole thing is just a base that I'm going to be taking back into ZBrush to add more detail to later. See there, I tried to move things without deleting my history and my lattices. This is another reason to keep everything loose as long as you can. You know, I made a decision here that I wanted to move those straps higher, and so, you know, if I had been really taking a whole lot of time getting everything just right, that would be a lot more painful. But since I've been keeping everything kind of loose and sketchy, it's not too bad moving things around. This is another part I was pretty happy with. And it's a kind of a common design principle of mine in general, which is basically subdividing shapes, right? So I have this strap, and it's got these smaller straps intersecting it, horizontally. It itself is made of multiple materials going around the edges, right? Well, and so intersecting it vertically looks pretty cool. It also makes sense mechanically, right? It's this strap weaves in between the metal pieces down at the bottom, and it's held in place by these by the horizontal straps that go over top of it. So creating layers of meshes, layers of detail, it just adds to the overall believability of the final design. It's also relatively easy for us to model this way, right? Because each individual piece of the design is its own mesh with its own disconnected topology. I don't have to worry about how this strap interacts with another strap. I just have to worry about this strap and then just kind of blend it in with the pieces it connects to. I find this is an easy way to work. So I'm just focusing on getting it into the right position. You see how I'm just kind of tucking it down behind that strap there. I ended up reworking that whole back piece later. But that sort of just proves my point, right? The back piece is not working, but this strap isn't dependent on it in order to work, just so long as there's connection points that we can use. Here I'm just blocking in some colors just to help myself think about the final material a little bit. I'm always, trying to think ahead. But the main goal at this point is to get this, this strap detail fitting in a way that makes sense. Again, I wasted time doing it on both sides. Wasn't necessary. Final result was mirrored. Mirroring is better for, texture resolution on the final game mesh anyway. Mirroring is always good if you can get away with it. I find I try to use mirroring for game assets, at least. I try to use mirroring on anything that is not different in design, right? So like I'll only not mirror a character's arm if he's got two different arms, right? And that's for two reasons. On the one hand, I don't want to model the same arm twice, right? It just feels time consuming, and it feels like kind of a waste of time. There's also kind of good reasons though, because if they're supposed to be the same and you model it two different times, they're going to look different, and sometimes that difference isn't good. Even if it's realistic, there's asymmetries in real life, but sometimes it just doesn't quite look right. Sometimes people are kind of expecting to see it be mirrored. Now, obviously, if you've got some really glaring little detail, like if one of these straps had like a really pronounced scratch or tear on it, if that's mirrored, then that's not going to look good. So you should think about that. But generally, if it's not important for there to be such a pronounced feature, I'll mirror every time, and that's to save me time. It's also to save the final game texture budget, right? Because we're only allowed so many textures on the GPU at a time, so the more we can mirror on one texture, the better overall resolution we can achieve without stressing the GPU too much. These are all considerations that we as 3D artists for games have to balance. This whole time I've been talking, I've just been doing the same thing, just roughing out this strap, which ended up not being used, or only one of them ended up being used. That's another good reason, though, to do this the way that I did, and to not mirror too early. Basically, I've given myself two tries at the same strap, right? And so when the time did come in this process that I decided to mirror, I chose the one that I thought looked better. So that's a kind of built-in advantage to working this way. And then after you make that decision and you do decide to mirror, if you realize that, really it is too symmetrical and you need to break it up a bit, you can always do that. It's never too late. You can take that mirrored version and, mix it up a little bit, beat it up, change a little bit of the design. It's easier to change something that already exists than to make something from scratch. So that's the main thing that I guess I want to communicate about my process. Is it's gradual. I start everything rough. I start everything blocky. I keep everything blocky as for as long as I have to, and as I refine it and get it closer to what I want, then I refine it more. That's the name of the game, just constant refinement. Here I'm deleting my old meshes of the straps from my ZBrush file. I'm not afraid of deleting them because I have them backed up in a layer in Maya. So if I decide for whatever reason I do want to go back, I can always go into that layer in Maya and pull them back out, send them back to ZBrush. That's my personal workflow between Maya and ZBrush. Sometimes I don't even maintain a ZBrush file. Sometimes I just let my Maya file be my whole, kind of, my main file, and everything I take in ZBrush just goes back to Maya. And sometimes I don't even save my ZBrush file, but on larger projects I maintain a Maya and a ZBrush file. I did on this one. I still have I maintained a ZBrush file alongside it. But I don't maintain a backup of every single thing in my ZBrush file. I save that for Maya. Here I'm going through the same process I've shown before of solidifying the straps. Using the move brush to kind of get them into place. Looking at everything together holistically. Making sure everything is moved into place there. I believe I just dynameshed that. Yeah, I'm dynameshing that base strap again, which you recall was decimated and then warped in Maya. And here we go, look at this. Remember how I said we could touch it up later in ZBrush? That's what I'm doing right here. With the same old brushes, clay tubes, smooth, H polish, damn standard. You see how all those artifacts from warping the decimated mesh, they're still visible, but I just brushed them right out. It didn't turn out to be a problem at all. Here I'm using damn standard and clay tubes to just accentuate some of the details that I made in Maya. You recall, while we were in Maya, I added edge loops to create that kind of, raised edge on this piece. And it looked pretty cool in Maya, but, now that we're in ZBrush, it's just so easy, since it's already there, for me to just kind of give another pass on it, just sort of accent it a little bit more, add a little bit of imperfection. And I am going to do this individually on each strap, I believe, aside from the fact that I'll mirror it. But just like I copied and warped it in Maya, I could always do that same thing here in ZBrush. This part is interesting. You see what I just did was I utilized the polygroups that ZBrush created to create a mask and then extract from that mask. And the point being to get a one-sided, thinner piece than the base piece. Now I'm, since I made it thinner, I'm looking at the overall thing and I'm realizing this whole thing is too thin. And so I'm just, rather than going back a few steps and going back into Maya, I'm just using the move tools in ZBrush to just simply change its width. It may have been more efficient to do this in Maya. It would have certainly been more efficient to get it the right thickness on the first try, but I didn't. I made a mistake in Maya. I made this strap too thin. I couldn't tell how thick it needed to be at the time, because I didn't have the context. And so now that I know, I'm just fixing it the fastest way I can, which is just to do it here in ZBrush. If I was less comfortable in ZBrush, I'd probably go back to Maya to fix that, but this is something I'm comfortable doing in ZBrush, so that's how I did it. You can see it really doesn't take that long. Just going to a lower subdivision level. That's an important trick that took me some time to learn, is use your subdivision levels to your advantage. Moving to a lower subdivision level will make big reforming shapes a lot easier, because your mesh will be coarser, so you have less points you need to move. Then when you smooth it back out, it's all, interpolated between those coarser points. So it's almost like a lattice, if you think about it. If you think about it that way, your lowest subdivision level in ZBrush is basically a lattice for your highest subdivision level. This part was cool. I always like doing these kinds of cloth folds because it's always so easy to make it look realistic without it actually being realistic. And I'm just using the same old tried and true combination of clay tubes and dam standard, and sometimes all you need is just a little crease, and it just makes something look so much more detailed than it is. And we're able to get away with so much here because of these kind of overlapped layered details. Any one of these things taken in isolation is gonna honestly kind of look like crap, right? Like, if I'm gonna isolate one of these straps and look at it, it's not gonna look good. It's not gonna look like a strap or anything. But taken all together, it looks pretty cool. And of course, remember, this whole thing is going to turn into baked maps, right? So once we get that baked ambient occlusion, that bake is going to smooth all of these disconnected meshes together are going to look smoothed together because of the shading. And the final result is just going to look way more integrated than it will look here in ZBrush. This is something that you just sort of get a sense for after time and repetition. Here I'm just continuing the tedious, work of just sharpening edges using dam standard and clay tubes and H-polish. You see how I kind of go over the edge with dam standard to sharpen it. That creates a line that doesn't look very good. You then can take the clay tubes and draw up against the line, and that creates a ridge. And then you can use H-polish to smooth down that entire ridge, which ends up making it look a lot sharper. And I think, it's good for cloth because it doesn't look mechanically sharp the way that just modeling it in Maya would make it look. It doesn't look, it has a little more depth and texture to it than just a subdivision surface would have. You wouldn't want to use this for, mechanical stuff, but I think for, organic cloth stuff, I think it works pretty well. And here I'm using Dam Standard to just add some details into those horizontal straps. And I think that looked pretty cool. Kind of adds makes it look a little more folded, makes it look a little more compressed. And just compositionally, it's good. It's a good composition because this strap is intersecting our whole design, and then we have that little crease that intersects that strap. So if you think about it, it's like, constantly descending levels of detail. But you never want your smallest level of detail to be so small that it won't show up when the whole asset is viewed from a medium distance. Here I'm doing the same thing, just adding a little bit of depth and texture to this bottom strap. And it's just so easy. It's just so easy, with since we have, remember how I talked about how, putting our good topology where it'll help us out? The reason sculpting this is so easy is because we prepared for this when we made that base topology in Maya. These strap meshes, they're not dynameshed. They're just subdivision level, native ZBrush meshes. And because we modeled them with evenly spaced quads, we can sculpt on them with so much ease. I'm playing with the inflate option in ZBrush. Inflate can be very useful. I'm trying to push these two straps away from each other because remember I split them before, and so there's two of them. It's kind of the same principle as always, right? Intersecting details, building things on top of each other. See here, to make this look like it's folded into this metal piece, I'm just pushing the geometry through the metal piece, and it looks pretty cool. We don't have to make everything actually fit and work together. Like, we need to think about how it would work, right? Because we want it to make sense, but it doesn't actually have to, it doesn't have to actually thread through. It's enough for it to look like it's threading through. Depending, of course, on the final intended thing, what this is for your game. If your game is about, clicking these things together, then you would want to, you'd want to be careful with it. But, this is just going to be viewed from a distance, so an approximation is adequate. I'm just playing with the volume, building up volume where it looks like this would bunch, and cutting in where it feels like it would, where it would be folded. And then accentuating the edges, just trying to keep everything kind of, looking tight. And if it's necessary, if we deem we really need this to look better, I can always take this back into Maya and use Quad Draw with Live Surface and build a new mesh over this one. I don't think I did, though. I think this turned out to be the final strap. Yeah, and you see now that evidently I'm happy more or less with this shape, I'm starting to add these secondary details, secondary folds. But that's important. It's important to know, overall that it's working before adding those secondary details. Sometimes adding the secondary details lets you know if the main shape is working, because sometimes it just doesn't look right without them. And then once you try it, you think, yeah, that looks fine. Or you think, no, I need to take this back into Maya. I need to go back a few steps, and I need to clean this up more. But I think I ended up going with this. There I'm using the polygroups and masking to push out a ridge on one of these straps in conjunction with the inflate tool. Using smooth to kind of blend things together a bit. And I think overall that looks pretty cool. Here it looks like I'm experimenting with widening this central ridge out even more. There's not a whole lot of special tricks in this sculpting process. It's basically just building solid geometry in Maya, bringing it in, and then just using, whatever brushes work for you to just sort of refine them, add little details, reshape things where you need. And just taking your time, but trying to be conscious of your time as much as you can. But, sometimes things just take time, and this was one of them. Here I'm, working on it in isolation, and you can kind of see what I was talking about earlier, how like any one of these things in isolation just, kind of looks like crap. But it's all about the overall composition. Here I'm using Dynamesh, and then I'm about to use a clip brush to just cut out that bottom part because I don't need it. Dynamesh and the clip brushes are a really useful tool for just kind of just chopping things off when you don't need them. Now that I'm happy with the overall main shape, I'm starting to go in and add the little micro secondary shapes. Just using dam standard and clay tubes, just same process, but now working on smaller details. as I mentioned before, this is a lot of overlapping pieces, and so I'm not too concerned with each individual piece. I'm mostly just concerned with how they look together. And so that's kind of, that kind of frees things up a lot. That lets you just sort of focus on the way that it looks, and you can create really interesting looking shapes by just pushing and pulling objects through each other and overlapping them. This can be a pretty tedious process, and sometimes it doesn't all work out kind of right away. I think you'll see I wasn't too happy with any of these shapes, and so I think I came through eventually and just kind of blurred them all out, started over. Yeah, like that. For that, sometimes the smooth brush isn't enough, no matter how much you turn it up. There's a brush in the optional content for ZBrush called Smooth Stronger, and that just kind of does exactly what it says. It's smooth but stronger, and it's really good for that kind of work, just for just erasing work that you're not happy with. So sometimes you just gotta kind of stick with it. Just erase the things you don't like, try again. It usually comes together eventually. So I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of like what I think sort of makes good design, and one of those things is shapes that overlap and break each other up. So like these horizontal straps that I'm working on now, you see, I think without those, this would look really, well, for one thing, I mean, obviously it wouldn't make any sense, but it would also just look bad because it's too many parallel lines, right? You've got the lines of the straps, and then you've got the lines of the shoulder pads. They're all going the same direction. You need something to break it up, and that's where these horizontal straps come in. And then of course they have the added benefit of being functional, right? They are kind of holding these two pieces of material together, so that makes sense from a reality perspective. But even if that weren't the case, like even if I didn't need those there, I'd still add something horizontal to kind of break it up. And then your details, your little edge wear and damage and things like that, those things then can kind of come through and break those things up even more. So you kind of have this progression of subdividing your details, if that makes sense. And then like I have that fold that they come through at like 45-degree angles through the middle of the straps, and so that that adds some diagonals to otherwise more or less 90-degree composition, and so that just makes it look more interesting. So yeah, I guess while I'm just kind of going through all these little fine touches and doing all this repetitive stuff, maybe I'll try to talk about, maybe try to summarize, I guess, some things that I think are key to making this kind of stuff. And so one of them being break things up into multiple objects, make things simple on yourself. The more you can split things up into sub-objects, the better. Topology is important, but should serve your composition. So try to get a sense for when your topology is not going to cut it and needs to be redone versus when it is, good enough to kind of get you to the next step. So topology is important, and you need to master topology, but part of mastering it is understanding when you need to work on it and when you need to work on your design. Another core thing would be don't let your 3D tool dictate your design, right? Make your designs on paper. Think about your designs outside of 3D, and then use the right tool for the right job to make that happen. Don't shy away from a shape just because you know it'll be hard to model. Use the tools that you need to make the shapes that you need. And then within those tools, choose the right tool for the right job, right? So if you're not comfortable doing hard surface modeling in ZBrush, like me, like I'm not very good at that, don't do it. Do your hard surface in Maya. If you're not comfortable doing organic stuff in Maya, like me, I really don't like doing organic stuff in Maya, so don't do it in ZBrush. And just get used to keeping your files organized and come up with a workflow that works for you to minimize your time switching between applications. That's key to get the benefits, maximize the benefits of each software and minimize the downsides. And then I guess another thing I would say that's key is to work your project evenly. So like when you learn to sketch or paint, they tell you to work the canvas evenly, right? Which means don't over detail one object when your overall composition has not yet been established. You need to sketch everything roughly until you're happy with the whole thing from a macro perspective, and only then do you go in and you start adding details. And even then, you add your details systematically. Don't add all your details in one place, because then you're going to realize you're behind everywhere else, and you'll get slowed down and depressed because you don't have all you've got, so it looks like you have so far to go. Whereas if you work everything evenly, make rough drafts across the whole thing evenly, then the whole thing, you see it kind of come together at an even pace, which is what you want. So here I just deleted the other strap because I put so much work into this one. I'm like, I'm not doing that again. I'm just gonna mirror this. And for game assets, that's perfectly fine. That saves us texture res on the back end. There's all sorts of reasons to mirror stuff. So that's what I did. I'm using the Subtool Master mirror. You see I have it in my custom shelf there, so I can access it a little bit faster. These repetitive things, you can't avoid them, so the best thing you can do is make them faster and less painful. And custom menus, custom hotkeys are a really great way to do that. If you're going to be doing a lot of modeling and you don't have some kind of custom menu, then I really encourage you to take the time to make a custom menu. Here, hopping back into Maya. And so now you see my workflow for bringing this stuff back from ZBrush is to manage the visibility of my tools, so that only the subtools that I want to transfer are visible. And then after that, I use merge visible to merge them all into one new subtool. And then I can run decimation master on that without worrying about ruining the quality of my original. And then I guess an important consideration to make note of is, so you're going to end up with a lot of subtools in your subtool palette. But I only save the one master subtool. I don't save those merged ones or the decimated ones because it's just, it's easy to remake them. So there you go, there's my merge visible. Looks like I had a crash or something like that, so I just did it over again. And there you go, there it's decimated. Now I come into Maya, make a new version, and then I take all of these parts that are now out of date and I move them to my backup layer. That's just where I throw all the stuff that I, want to delete, but maybe I'm a little afraid to delete it. And then I just run my script to import that decimated mesh back into Maya. Now I've got context of, now I'm up to date. My ZBrush and Maya scenes look the same now. And now I can start using Maya to rough in the next big things. There we go, I deleted those things finally because I just wasn't happy with them the whole time. And so this is where I finally tried something new. And if you look at my reference images, this is, a lot of this is borrowed pretty closely from the Metro Exodus backpack, right? But, borrow where you can. So I made these poles, and the idea is that they can be kind of like affixed to the main body with clamps. And then now I'm kind of roughing out the like canvas straps that attach them together. And I'm just doing this in Maya because Maya gives me the kind of precision that I want for a block in. So I'm going to use Maya until I get that. Here I'm using my symmetry tools, establish a symmetrical topology base. And I'm just going to try to work through it evenly, get it all roughed in before I hop back to ZBrush to add details. And to me, this is where the work happens. Everything in ZBrush is, it's work, obviously, right? But it's just kind of fun. You're just kind of painting, basically, just sort of sculpting and just, refining and, there's not a whole lot of like brain work in ZBrush. All the brain work kind of happens here in Maya, at least in my workflow. And of course, remember, there's a million ways to do anything in 3D. This is just what I've found works for me and what I've found works for any kind of object. Like, this kind of stuff will work for a character, it'll work for a prop, it'll work for an environmental piece. There, you see I just split the that mesh off to make the back end of it. Utilize the scale tool to straighten the top line of verts. And so all of these like poly strips, these are all just one-sided poly strips, right? They're just extremely simple, but they're a framework. They're groundwork for something that's going to look a lot cooler really soon. So here I'm going back into ZBrush and deleting all the old stuff I don't like. I don't worry about saving that stuff because I know that I have it in my Maya file. That's just, again, my personal workflow. You may feel you need to make a backup or whatever of that, but I don't. I just delete it and you lean on my Maya file for if I want to get something like that back. 9 times out of 10, I don't want it back, right? So, but I've always got the option. I've always got the option to go into that backup layer in Maya and just, pull it back out, use my script to send it back to ZBrush and try something else. Here I'm starting to work on affixing those poles to the sides, trying to think about what's simple, what makes sense, what would be a practical real-world design, and what would look good. This serves two functions. On the one hand, it makes the whole thing make sense, because it can't just be floating in air. But on the other, it breaks up that large, flat piece of the backpack, and that just helps a lot visually. And then this is obviously it's for a stylized game, and one of the things one of the unique things about the style of this game is that it's all kind of simple. So, I'm a lot more okay with large, undetailed parts of things for this kind of style than I would be for something more realistic. But I think it's also cool, just from a design perspective, I think it's cool to have sort of simple and undetailed pieces, right up next to very detailed pieces. So I think that looks neat, having the kind of simplistic like frame next to the more detailed straps. I just think it creates interesting visual contrast. So I'm just going through my process of getting my stuff from Maya back to ZBrush now. That takes a lot of time, and it's a pretty big time sink, really, if I'm, being honest. But imagine how bad it would be without that kind of like custom script and sort of standardized workflow that I've got in place. There's probably a better way. There's probably some ways I could speed it up even more. And that's kind of the name of the game. Like, the less time I can spend, like, kind of just pressing buttons and, fighting with the computer, the more time I can spend on the actual art. I mean, that's the dream, right? To have 1 hour of your time equal 1 hour of art output. Unfortunately, that's just not realistic. That's not the case. 1 hour of your time is probably, when you're just starting out, I mean, gosh, it's probably 25 minutes of actual art output, and the rest is time spent struggling against the software. But, when you get more practiced with it, you kind of improve that ratio. Here I'm preparing more basic polygon strips for me to use in ZBrush as bases for details. So again, just focusing on keeping separate objects, starting out with solid topology so that I have something to work with later in ZBrush. Here I'm re-importing it again. I'm using the ZBrush, so yeah, that's another trick. I don't use Maya to create the thickness. I utilize the panel loops in ZBrush, and that's probably something I should add to my little quick shortcut menu. And then you'll notice the panel loops kind of blurs and makes everything look a little mushy, a little soft. But that's okay, because we're just going to come through and sculpt it. This is just a base layer, starting point to work from. Here I'm going through for the other pieces, getting them ready. And then kind of, along that same line of reasoning as, kind of working through evenly. It's the same thing. I do all my little technical mess arounds on, on all of these little pieces. Oh yeah, and then here I realized I needed some more loops, and so I gave a try at doing it using the ZBrush modeling tools. I'm pretty sure I gave up and went back to Maya. Yeah, there it is. Because it's just so much easier in Maya. Yeah, see, I can go in and redirect these edges, make sure everything's quads. And the reason I'm doing this is because it just wasn't smoothing out in ZBrush the way that I needed it to. And then it's easy to just re-import it using my little script. And again, my script is just an OBJ import. It's, you don't need a script to do it, it just saves a few clicks. Yeah, then I just kind of can play with it, pump up the thickness a bit using inflate, And then just use my move brushes to start kind of just getting it into rough placement. And then probably before I start actually sculpting, I do those last little corner pieces. So you gotta check everything. You know, everything has to work together in harmony. And so, you know, it's just kind of a process, just because you add one thing and it kind of affects everything else. Okay, so I am starting to sculpt using Dam Standard to sharpen those edges that the subdivision blurred out. There we go, now I'm working on those pieces. So yeah, never get too far into the details before, you know, catching those last pieces that are lagging behind. Try to keep everything even in terms of detail. I think I even ended up changing the overall way that these work, changing them from being just little things. See, that's right. So I realized that those didn't make sense anymore. So it's, you know, it's a good thing I didn't spend too much time detailing them, right? Because all this detail is now getting mangled as I reshape this. But I didn't know it had to be reshaped at the time, so you've just got to always kind of keep everything loose. Don't hold on too tightly to any of your details, right? Because if they're not serving the composition, they've got to go. There I'm using masking and move to make some big changes to that back cloth piece. Try to keep these things in a way that looks like a believable union. It's just a constant battle for this kind of stuff. And again, the more time you spend on your concept art, the less of a battle this has to be, right? So I probably didn't spend enough time thinking about this on paper, and so I'm, you know, suffering the consequences now. But that's kind of what makes it a good demonstration too, because it's inevitable. You'll have situations like this and just have to figure it out in 3D. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to plan ahead. So here I'm starting to add some details to these pieces, and it's bothering me that there's such small overlap, such little contact between the two pieces. And now that I'm, you know, adding those details, it's becoming more obvious why I guess it's bothering me. And I think I end up reworking all of this to be just one long strap that goes across. I mean, could I have kept it this way? You know, sure. Yeah, there's nothing, you know, no rule says it couldn't be this way, but that's, you know, that's where the fun comes in. You get to do everything the way you want it to be. taking a little time to pay attention to the insides, the things that can't really be seen. Because even though it can't be seen, it kind of, it kind of looks better if it works. You can kind of tell from the outside. So I'm just making sure that there's actually room for these things to overlap and all that kind of stuff. It can be a grind just trying to refine all these little things and make sure everything looks good from every angle. Of course, every time you change one thing, then it kind of affects something else, and on and on. While I go through all this kind of tedious stuff that's already been kind of explained ad infinitum, I guess I'll just take a minute to kind of reiterate that, the core tools you really need to get something done, they're, these programs seem so overwhelming, right? Like, you open up Maya and ZBrush and there's all these buttons everywhere. They've got different navigation schemes, they've got different like ways of working that, it can seem overwhelming, and it is overwhelming because there's just so much packed into these programs. They've been adding features to them for, quite literally decades. So, they're very complex. They do a lot of things. But it's important to remember that, you only need to understand a small subsection of the available tools in here. Like to really get something done, this example, like I'm probably touching less than 10%, probably less than 5% of the tools in Maya and ZBrush. And like, have I used other tools? Sure. I've used all sorts of stuff for different things, but you kind of like can find those things when you need them. Google's your friend, but it's just important, I think, to have sort of your like short list of tools that can get you through like 80% of situations, right? And then you don't need to be looking up every little thing. And yeah, like I mentioned it at the beginning, but I think I kind of have a huge problem with these tutorials that are step by step, like just press this button, then press this button, then press that button, and and you'll get the exact same result as the instructor. To me, that's worse than useless, right? Because you're not learning why the instructor made those decisions. You're not learning how to actually use those tools. You're just like following a recipe, and just like, anyone can, follow a recipe, but like a chef knows why, certain ingredients are chosen, right? And maybe that's kind of a stupid analogy, but, hopefully you kind of get what I'm saying. Like, I want you to kind of see these tools, see what's available, and use them for what you want to make. And if you don't need, maybe, you might not need half of these tools. You might not be trying to make something that looks all battered and worn, so you don't need damn standard, right? You might just need smooth and polish, right? But kind of knowing, kind of seeing a whole, take the whole thing like holistically and try to, make your decisions based on your project, not just following some step by step thing. And, that'll set you up for success. And that gives you a foundation that you can just kind of build on. Just build and build and build, and you just get a little better every time. And I'm speaking to myself here too. I see people's work online that's just amazing, and I think, man, I wish I could model like that. And maybe someday after I work as hard at it as they have, maybe I will. Right? So that's kind of, we're all kind of at our level, and we're all kind of getting better. So the tools are here to support that. Not the other way around. Don't get lost in the tools. And don't get overwhelmed. Yeah, to return to my original point, don't worry if you don't understand what every little button and slider does. Nobody does. you know, they're not there. They're not all there for you. They're there for other workflows. Half the stuff in Maya is for rigging and animation. As a 3D modeler, you don't necessarily care about that, right? Obviously benefits you to learn a little bit about everything you can, even if it's outside your discipline. So, don't shy away from it. Maybe watch some videos on rigging and animation, but don't stress yourself out over not knowing everything. Looks like I'm getting ready to send stuff back to ZBrush for another pass. Yeah, it looks like it was just bothering me that my proxy model had some holes in it, so I went into Maya and converted the subdiv preview to polygons so I could get it into ZBrush looking correct. I'm using polygroup split. That just takes every polygon island and makes it its own group. And that makes it easier for me to split things off into their own subtools. ZBrush has kind of a weird kind of logic to it in terms of like subtool management. That would probably be a good candidate for a short video, just kind of all on its own. But there's also dozens of videos out there that already cover it, I'm sure. Again, kind of my goal with this video is to fill a niche that I see being empty, which is just long form, unedited, or very slightly edited, just nitty gritty, not step by step. Just one way to do this stuff. Not necessarily the best way, but a way. here I'm hopping back to Maya and deleting all that old stuff and importing my decimated mesh from ZBrush. And I think this is where I probably start to rework the whole thing. Yep, yeah, there it is. So I'm using the quad draw tool with live surface turned on to use my existing geometry as a base to build a new polygon strip to support this kind of new structure that I'm thinking about. Basically what I'm thinking it needed is, just it needed something a little more simpler, something a little stronger that looks more capable of holding all that stuff together, because those 4 connecting points just didn't look like they would quite cut it, just in terms of weight bearing, since this is a heavy backpack. It looks like for some reason I'm actually making the thickness here in Maya rather than using the poly loops in ZBrush. So, that works too. More than one way to skin a cat. And that's why, because I was trying to kind of create that kind of loop. Make sure it's really defined. So I was using Maya to do that. So yeah, here we go, more just same old ZBrush, just reshaping. There we go again with that same kind of 45-degree angle that I mentioned before, making your details kind of run at angles to the main lines of your composition. It's just kind of a good rule of thumb. Nothing new here, it's just the same stuff that I did on all the rest of the straps, just using move, dam standard, clay tubes, smooth, H-polish, utilizing the subdivision levels to make sweeping changes and higher subdivision levels to make more fine-tuned changes. I'm just hiding the straps so I can get a better view of what I'm doing. Just refining all the edges. See there, it's a lot easier to make big moving shifts at lower subdivision levels. This part here was one of my favorites. I didn't expect this to work out nearly as well as it did, but basically after getting my rough shape dialed in, I wanted to just sort of rough in this texture, this kind of like quilted pattern. And so I was just using damn standard to just freehand just draw these diagonal lines just to kind of like convince myself if I really wanted to do it or not, and it kind of just turned out fine. And I love it when that happens because it's one of my favorite parts of the design, and it was by far the easiest part. I did it again, I did it over again a few times. Here I'm just playing with the layers, kind of playing with the strength. The layer system in ZBrush is pretty useful, but to be honest, I barely ever use it. You can find, plenty of videos on it and stuff. Basically, the idea is you can kind of have details recorded in a layer, and then you can go back to the layer beneath it and make changes without affecting the information you have in the layer above. And so basically I'm just trying to go in here and add some more like folds and like low frequency cloth details like under the texture. I think I ended up just kind of keeping it simple in the end, but I guess just playing around with it. But yeah, it was shocking to me how the freehand damn standard actually just kind of worked. Trying to make those two layers of detail kind of work nicely together. Kind of underlying folds were kind of clashing with the diamond pattern, so I think I just kind of ended up turning it down a little bit and just sort of focusing on the diamond pattern. And here I'm trying the same thing, but this time at 90-degree angles rather than 45s. Had to turn off symmetry to actually make it work. And yeah, again, I was shocked that kind of looked fine. Now that would not be fine in a more realistic asset. You would definitely want to kind of spend more time and attention on it if this was to be a photorealistic asset, but for the style I'm going for, I know that when I get to the texturing phase, I'm going to have a lot of, thick ink outlines on all those details, and it's just going to look fine. And then here, this is another trick that I love. There's all sorts of complicated ways you can do stitching in ZBrush, and a lot of them are really sophisticated. But sometimes, nothing beats just freehanding it with damn standard. And you see I just use it in minus mode to build up a ridge, and then I use it in normal mode to cut a little, trough around the ridge. And, it works sometimes. Again, sometimes, you can get like custom stitch brushes like on ArtStation, or you can make your own custom stitch brushes. And I've used those too, they're great, more power to you, but sometimes it's like, it would have taken me just as long to find, and like I have custom stitch brushes, but it would have taken me longer to find the file on my hard drive and load it into ZBrush than it took me to just freehand it with damn standard. So sometimes that's just the way I do it, because It's kind of all about speed, you know. Like I said, I'm 11 hours into this thing, so if I can save myself a little bit of time, I'm gonna save it. And besides, it's just fun. Sometimes just freehanding. And again, it all comes down to the style that you're going for. You know, the game, my game that this is designed for, it's got a really hand drawn, kind of rough style. If I was making this for a super clean, super realistic game, then this wouldn't cut it. It looks like I decided, I didn't like those, so I just blasted them out with Smooth Stronger and just redid them. My whole philosophy too is, I might not even like the stitches being there, right? So this way, if I decide I don't like them, I didn't spend that long putting them in, so I'll not feel bad taking them out and trying something else. Whereas if I spent a lot of time developing a custom stitching brush, then, odds are I'm not gonna erase them later. I like to keep it simple. I like to keep things loose and, just kind of make decisions gradually. Here I'm wanting to add a little more, sort of, bisect that piece with another one, and so I just duplicated it and just kind of sculpting them into place. Sometimes that's all the detail you really need. Now that I'm happy with that, going through and as usual, just adding more of these secondary details. I don't bother about combining the two pieces, I just sculpt on them individually. Looks cool and keeps it simple. And yet I'm always keeping in mind that at the end of the day, this is my high poly model. None of it's going into the game. It's all going to be remeshed. It's all going to be, remeshed and UV'd, and this is just going to project textures for me. So I'll have another opportunity to kind of clean this up or maybe even change it around a bit in Photoshop later. So I don't agonize over it, I just get it looking right at a distance. And then yeah, also of course, it's for a game, so it's never going to be taking up the whole screen at once. It's always going to just be a little, it's probably going to be less than 500 pixels across on your actual monitor. So a lot of these details are, they'll just be kind of blurred anyway. If you can make it to where a player actually walks up and takes a second to look at it, and it still looks good, then your job is done. Chances are they won't even take a second to look at it. the same thing I did on the top one. I just duplicated that strap and I'm just using it to create a second layer. Just gives it a little more depth, makes it look a little more interesting. Kind of insisting and enhancing some of those folds. ZBrush added this handy feature for quick views, or like kind of presets of subtool visibility. It's really handy. Use that to, quickly like hide pieces that I'm not wanting to focus on. Trying to just add some more kind of damage and weathering to this thing, break up that long, boring, uninterrupted patch. Using dam standard to kind of insist on different details, kind of just trying to enhance the edge flow. Later on, this will give me kind of a guide when I'm retopologizing in Maya, kind of a guide to follow. And of course, as always, gotta kind of shift everything around. Yeah, this is the fun part to me. It might be the most boring part to watch, but it's fun because you can just kind of zone out, listen to some music or something, and just draw lines on your mesh. You can definitely overdo it. I may have even overdone it on this, but like I said, it's a stylized game. I can get away with a lot more than I could if it was photorealistic. That's something that could maybe bear a minute to talk about, is even with photorealistic games, there is sort of this concept you should be aware of, which is like kind of stylizing your shapes. Like even in a photorealistic game, you don't want everything to be realistic. And what I mean by that is, in reality, some things are really, really thin, right? And like long, thin shapes. And long, thin shapes just don't render well. They're prone to aliasing, meaning the edges look jagged, and they don't read well on screen, meaning, they just kind of, there's not enough pixels to really draw it effectively, so it just kind of gets blurred. So you'll notice a lot of AAA game assets, if you look like on ArtStation at like professional, game high poly assets, they're not exactly realistic in terms of their proportions. Everything is kind of like chunked up, like everything's thicker, everything's like more beveled than it would be in reality. And that's the reason. It's because just overly straight lines just don't really render well. So you always kind of want things to be thicker, heavier, rounder. It just looks better. And people won't really think that it doesn't look realistic, because just the way that things look in games, it's going to just feel right. Especially if you're talking about console games where, players are sitting on a couch looking at a TV screen from far away. It's like if you make things realistic, overly realistically proportioned, they'll just be invisible. So you really need to just fatten everything up and just really err on the side of chunky. And then same goes for 90-degree angles. There are no 90-degree angles in nature. Everything, even look at even the edge of a table. like just like the sharpest edge you can find, or you know, a wall, it's never really 90 degrees, right? It's always a little bit curved, just because reality is like that. You know, things get worn down. But to take it a step further in games, it's like even if you have something that should be roughly 90 degrees, you really don't want it to be. Like, you really want all your surface changes to be as minimal as possible. And that just helps your baked maps look better. So that's just a good rule of thumb. This is nearly done now. The biggest issue is that large, totally undetailed front panel, but that I'm going to detail with texture. There'll be some stripes on it, just painted, and that'll break that up and make it look cool. I think we're almost done. I think the last part I did here is the hinge, and this part was a lot of fun. It was really difficult. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of thinking to kind of get it to work right. But yeah, you see I'm starting to kind of rough it in here in Maya. So basically the problem is there's nowhere for this hinge to actually go. And so I needed to cut in here. So it's a little hard to explain, I think, what I'm going for here, but it should be fairly evident watching. Basically, I'm trying to block in this hinge, trying to make sure that it can actually physically fit in here. And then the final thing was actually not quite perfect because it kind of clips a little bit when it opens completely wide, but you know, really, if I were doing this for like client work or something, I would have spent more time and made sure that none of that clipping was happening. But at the end of the day, it's a personal project. I'm the client, right? So I'm fine with it. Yeah, so I just split out that top piece, and I'm using it to rough in the other side of this hinge. Yeah, so there's a lot of tricks going on here. So I just duplicated that, merged them, and bridged it. Now I've got this kind of poly, you know, base, and I start extruding the edges to add some volume to it. And target weld those points, and then delete that and utilize mirroring. So I'm trying to establish this, you know, hinge piece. You'll see I just made a big N-gon there. You know, that's often a no-no, but when it's flat, you know, it's not a big deal. And again, this is still just my high poly model, so if it looks good, it is good. Again, remember what I was saying about 90-degree angles and how there are no such thing. Always very conscious of trying to bevel things. Okay, so here I'm experimenting, trying to figure out how the heck this thing can actually go together. I was trying to figure out some way to do it without having to cut a notch into the body of the radio, but that turned out to be necessary. And it actually turned out to be a lot cooler because it made you able to see the hinge details when the radio is closed, which was a a cool side effect that I wasn't really intentionally planning on. Here I'm setting all this up and I'm setting my pivot point so that I can actually rotate the lid and it will move along the hinge properly. And so here I'm having trouble finding the center point of that N-gon. I either just eyeballed it or I might have added a cylinder. Eventually I added a cylinder in the middle there just to mark the center point. But for now it looks like I'm just eyeballing it. Yeah. And then so you see I've got all those meshes, they're all children of the main door. And so now it's hinging properly, but it clips a lot. And so the solution is to move this out so that the pivot point is shallower, right? And that'll reduce the clipping. But in moving that out, then I had to rework a lot of stuff about the way the whole thing is constructed. Still clipping, but I'm starting to kind of get an idea for what I have to do to make this work. And you see I'm playing with different pivot positions and trying to figure out where the best pivot is to minimize the clipping. So you see as I move it in, the clipping is worse. As I move it out, the clipping gets better. There's probably some mathematical principle behind that, but I was just kind of figuring it out. And you have to move it all the way to the very outside, then that's the best. So you see, that's how you know I'm about to start really chopping it up. I just made a duplicate and moved it off to the side. So if I screw this up, I, have a backup and I can go back to square one and try again. So now I'm trying to think, how do I make room for this hinge? Playing around with the positioning of the hinges, trying to find something that kind of looks cool and makes practical sense. So here I'm starting to see what I need to do, but I'm trying to do it in a way that'll not mess up my subdivision smoothing. So trying to keep my edge flow smooth, trying not to have too many abrupt angles. Trying not to introduce too many poles. Or marking those edges as sharp and then testing out a smooth. Trying to see if I can get away with this. Making some edge flow to kind of protect that curve. Shoring it up further by marking the edges sharp. And yeah, I think at that point I was thinking, well, that wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Still got some clipping problems. Try and just kind of move stuff out of the way. Just experimenting. I kind of like that that shape that it created. Obviously it's all kind of mangled now, but it's got kind of a neat sort of retro sci-fi futuristic feel to it. And that's one of those kind of happy accidents, you know, because I didn't really design this thing that way. Trying to clean this up, trying to find a way that'll make this work. So as you can see, I've got some bad poles around that shape. But if you recall the overall design, there's actually a piece that fits in there and kind of covers that up. And so I think I ended up leaving it. Maybe not, maybe I did try to fix it. But I probably didn't have to. Could have probably just covered it over. Trying to figure out why that point there is smoothing kind of weird. But at that point, I think I just decided to move on and try to focus on the hinges. Part was pretty cool. I just kind of blocked that in with a cylinder and then used the default Maya Helix tool. Every now and then there's just the perfect little tool for something. Fix those normals, because the normals were all messed up from scaling. And then here I'm getting this ready to bevel. Again, trying to avoid overuse of right angles. You see how much better that looks? Just even a small bevel just adds so much depth. And then I'm adding this little piece here because when we retopologize this, I don't want there to actually be that negative space on the inside. And so that'll just kind of allow me to make the hinges one solid piece. But they'll still have this nice detail to them. And then there I'm reusing that part. Once it's done, you can just reuse it. Reparenting them so that they move along with my main piece, and that is looking pretty cool. I left the other hinges a little simpler for the sake of balancing details. If you over detail, then it all just kind of gets lost, but if you put details next to less detailed parts, then it looks cool. Oh yeah, then that's an important little step. I had modeled that nice U shape on the inside, but because it was pushed all the way through the door piece, it was getting lost. So just reshaped it. It's just another case of making sure all of your parts are working together in harmony. And then here I'm adding that cylinder to just mark the centerpiece. That way I can get everything lined up perfectly. Just a lot of fiddling with this kind of practical mechanical modeling. The key is to get all your moving parts in place properly, and then detail them just as much as you have to. Make sure your pivots are all aligned. See, I tried to rotate it there and it all kind of skewed out because the pivot wasn't centered. So there, I just centered the pivot using the center vertex of that cylinder, and now it works properly. And again, like I said, there's still some clipping. It doesn't have as much range of motion as I might like. It can really only open like a little more, like maybe 96 degrees or something like that. Oh yeah, and then I've got this piece here that's interfering, so just using proportional edit move to just kind of shove it back into place. And that kind of works. At this point, we're nearly done. I think I just kind of noticed that you know how I hate right angles. The way that those hinges intersect kind of makes a nasty, kind of boring right angle. So an easy fix was just add another piece in here, just with some beveled sides. And that's what I did, and it was kind of enough, I think. Helps out just a little bit. If you can do easy stuff, then do easy stuff. Here I'm just stealing that screw, which is just a sphere, and I'm just putting that there to just kind of add a little bit of realism. And then yeah, getting rid of that other 90-degree angle by just spreading it out. I think that looks pretty cool, actually. And there I'm just taking advantage of things just kind of blending together, and when it's all baked, the ambient occlusion pass is going to really kind of tie it all together. There, I just duplicated that one and scaled it. Just moved my marker over off to the side. I can always just reset its transforms to get it right back to where it needs to be. And here I'm using that backed up original shape to create an inset profile. Yeah, that actually helps a lot. So see, there's another good reason to back up your previous shapes. Sometimes you need them for things other than just backups. And there we go, just simple overlapping shapes create complicated looking shapes. That looks so much better. there you have it. That's the final backpack. Alright, you made it. Congratulations on watching the whole video. I really hope you learned something. I think this process is a pretty good one for making all sorts of assets. It can be applied to basically anything you can think of. I'm hopefully going to create another one of these overviewing the retopology and baking process and game engine import and texturing as well. So yeah, if it was helpful, let me know, and thanks for watching.